Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am once again joined by Caleb Maupin. This is our third time discussing your content, Caleb. Happy to have you here. Why don't you tell people who you are if they don't know and where they can find you?
Well, I'm a journalist and political analyst. I'm the founder of the Center for Political Innovation, which is an anti-imperialist education project. Yeah, I've been doing anti-imperialist activism. I report for international media. I've been to a lot of countries. I've been to Russia a number of times. I've been to Iran a number of times. I've written a number of books. And I think we need to oppose globalism and imperialism, which is the system that's oppressing people all over the world. So there we go.
All right. So I think what is on most people's minds, Caleb, is you've stated publicly on Twitter and elsewhere that you're no longer identifying as a communist. So could you explain two things? One, what led you down that path? And then two, presumably you didn't give up all the socialist stuff. So you kept something, but then gave something up. So if you could describe that as well, that'd be great.
Well, let me just back up, and I guess this will be a bit of a long-winded answer, but for me, the whole reason I became a communist was because when I was growing up in Ohio in a small town in the 90s, it was common knowledge that socialism and communism never worked. They had failed everywhere it had ever been tried. It was unsuccessful. It just led to everyone starving and miserable. I was told communism is when everyone gets paid the exact same wage, no matter how hard they work, and it just never worked. And the Soviet Union, they were all starving and poor, and China was starving and poor, and so communism just didn't work. And I discovered at a young age basic economic data about how the Soviet Union had electrified the entire country, had invented space travel, had, wiped out illiteracy, and all the amazing economic achievements the Soviet Union had, particularly in the 1930s when the Western capitalist economy was crashing and burning. And I was just like, I've been lied to. And the entire conversation about economics in America is predicated on that lie, that you can't have a planned economy, that you just have to have the free market, because every time you try anything other than the free market, everyone just starves and dies and is miserable. And I learned that was not the truth. And so I became interested in communist groups, and I was never interested in any of the that's not real communism stuff. I went straight for tankies, right? I was around a Maoist group, the Revolutionary Communist Party. And in college, I joined the Workers' World Party, which was led by Ramsey Clark, which was, a group that had ties to North Korea and had ties to Cuba, and also supported other anti-imperialist countries like Iran and Venezuela and stuff. And for me, it was about basically that, no, you can have a planned economy and you can raise people up out of poverty. I was part of Occupy Wall Street. I was the main spokesperson for Ramsey Clark and the International Action Center during Occupy Wall Street. And at the time that Occupy Wall Street was going on, the bombing of Libya took place. And that was a pivotal moment in my political development, because I looked at Libya and I saw a socialist society that had the highest life expectancy in Africa, that was building and had built the world's largest irrigation system, the Great Man-Made River. I saw people all over the African continent trying to get into Africa, to get into Libya, to try and get, the jobs that Gaddafi was offering to any African who showed up there. I heard about Gaddafi was building an independent African bank with its own, independent African currency. And so I was totally on the side of Gaddafi. And the overwhelming majority of leftists, socialists, Trotskyists, anarchists were supporting the campaign against Gaddafi and thought Gaddafi was an evil dictator or whatever. It was because Gaddafi wasn't pro-LGBT, which honestly, Libya was quite nice to LGBT people in comparison to like other places in that region. But because Gaddafi wrote some stuff they thought was sexist in his Green Book, because Gaddafi was considered a dictator or whatever, and because the protests against Gaddafi were framed as this woke protest human rights movement that was just like Occupy Wall Street, the overwhelming majority of leftists supported the overthrow of Gaddafi. I opposed it. And even the communist group I was in, the Workers' World Party, which technically supported Gaddafi, did so in a very weak and mild way. It was always, well, we don't think he's good, and and it was done in this very, very terrified way. So I went and read the Green Book by Gaddafi. And I read that book and I said, Libya is a socialist country, just like Cuba, just like North Korea. In fact, it's more of a socialist state-run economy than China is. I mean, it's a socialist country. And the answer I was given, Libya is not really a socialist country because they don't believe in Marxism, Leninism, the official ideology. Cuba believes in Marxism, Leninism, so they're socialist. But Gaddafi's Libya, because Gaddafi doesn't espouse the Marxist-Leninist ideology, it's not a socialist society. And I thought, well, that's ridiculous because, this is about material reality. And if the economy functions in a socialist way, it's socialist no matter what the leader says they believe. And so that was my first moment where I was just like, something's off. And then I started traveling. And I went to Iran, and I spent a lot of time in Iran, and I learned about their revolution in Iran and how they have 5-year economic plans, just like the old Soviet Union did, how they have state-run industries, and how they have these things in every neighborhood called Basij councils that are just like the committees to defend the revolution in Cuba. They're like local committees that carry out the will of the supreme leader and the revolutionary ideology on a local level. And I said, there's really not much of a difference between Iran's economy and China's economy, Iran's economy and Vietnam or Cuba's economy. They just don't believe in Marxism-Leninism. And in fact, they are against capitalism. A slogan that they have painted on the walls in Iran and various places says, not capitalism, but Islam. And they admire Hugo Chavez, and they admire Che Guevara, and they gave weapons to the IRA, and they consider their revolution to be part of the wave of anti-colonial revolutions that came after the Second World War. And I'm like, something's a little bit off. And then as I was back in the United States, increasingly leftist circles became obsessed with the transgender thing. They became extremely hostile to anyone who talked about defending the countries that are under attack by imperialism. Something was off. And then Trump, ran for president in 2016. And I could see that a lot of people were voting for Trump for very good reasons, because they wanted to stop the wars, because they wanted economic development, because they felt like the rich, there was a group of rich people that ran the government who didn't care about them. And all the communist groups, their attitude toward Trump supporters was they're all racist, they're all evil people, and anyone who would vote for Trump is just a bad person. And so on that basis, I kind of, parted ways with the Workers' World Party. And I was kind of confused. For a while, we had a youth group called Students and Youth for a New America that met in New York City. I would give classes on the history of Marxism. And then I started a YouTube channel, and I had a YouTube channel where I was talking about Marxist ideas. And we eventually launched the Center for Political Innovation. And from the beginning, our message was that we were the real communists, right? I was out of the movement to the masses. We said, get away from the left and get to the masses and build a real communist movement. But, I believe in God, and I returned to my Christian faith when I was in Iran. I had kind of a religious experience. I admitted that I wasn't a pure dialectical materialist. The dialectical philosophy that says, all that exists is matter, and that matter is constantly in a state of conflict, and conflict is good because that's how history is driven forward. I never really fully embraced that. And as I reconnected with my Christian faith and believed in God and such, it became clear to me that worldview wasn't, the philosophical view underlying Marxism wasn't exactly right. And also the communists I was around knew nothing about it and didn't care. They just wanted to tail after whatever was trendy among the left. So I had my differences there. For a while, our talking point was, we're the real communists. We're the real communists. The woke left are phonies. We're the real communists. And after a while, I realized, what's the point? What's the point of saying that? At this point, communism in America is synonymous with stuff that I am totally against. It used to be, if I told average Americans I'm a communist, they'd be like, wow, how can you ever be that? Tell me what that's about. Now, if I tell people I'm a communist, they say, oh, I know what you are. You have pink hair. You are obsessed with the transgender issue. You think all Republicans are Nazis, and you want everyone to be poorer to save the environment. I don't believe any of those things. I believe in economic growth. I'm an American patriot. I love my country. I support the countries around the world that are struggling to break out of globalism, imperialism. And I want America to do the same thing. I think that that we are in the same struggle that the Iranians, the Cubans, and the Russians and the Chinese are involved. And we're struggling against this same system of imperialism, globalism, and I identify with them. So because of that, I would say I still advocate a planned economy, the banks and the factories being organized to serve public good and not the profits of a wealthy few. I am still thinking that imperialism, the system of monopolistic capitalism and the rule of the world by big bankers, is the main enemy. But communism is no longer synonymous with that in the American mind. And what I do admit, and I didn't used to admit this, the seeds of woke toxicity were in communism to begin with. That dialectical philosophy has big problems with it. And that Marxism began as a continuation of the ideals of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was toxic in a lot of ways. And it was that radical intelligentsia that Marx came out of was very dark and was very evil in a lot of ways. So I view, Lenin took Marxism in a whole new direction. Bolshevism was a whole new thing. Lenin had said that, or Marx had said the revolution would happen in Europe. And that Europe was the most advanced and that they would have communism first. And Lenin said, well, actually, no, it's going to be colonized countries that do it. Marx had said nationalism is wrong. We reject all nationalism. Lenin said, well, nationalism of the colonized people is good. Marx had wanted to create some kind of ultra-democratic organization where everyone voted on everything and all of that. Lenin developed a party of new type that was kind of grounded in Russia's history of secret societies like the Old Believers and the Decembrists. So Lenin, he took Marx's ideas and he took them in an Eastern direction. Stalin took it even further east, and people look at what Stalin did, and that there was a deeply conservative aspect of what Stalin did, right? Stalin set up a state that while it was industrializing and while it was, empowering women, etc., it was also kind of mimicking feudalism. He outlawed homosexuality. He outlawed abortion. He glorified the Soviet family. And in a lot of ways, he kind of took the aesthetics and some of the values of the Orthodox Church and incorporated them in building this kind of new synthesis that was like a combination of the values of the deeply conservative Russian peasantry and the Orthodox Church and the radical liberal intelligentsia that Marxism came from. And he kind of combined them into this new synthesis that people call Stalinism. And you'll notice that most of the Marxist intellectuals of Europe jumped ship at that point and became Trotskyites, denounced the Soviet Union, etc. And Stalinism was kind of its own thing. And I would argue that especially since the end of the Cold War, what you might call Stalinism has become even further from European revolutionary intelligentsia and their attitude, and has developed even more into its own kind of thing. And that Marxism, or the left of the West, has just become more and more this destructive, toxic ideology, really kind of an aesthetic or a set of values that come out of the French Revolution that is really destructive and toxic. So I don't identify with the left anymore. I don't call myself a Marxist or a communist anymore because it doesn't connotate what I stand for. I stand with the people of the world against globalism, imperialism, and I think the American people need to follow their example and break our country out, and I'm a patriot because I want that. So at this point, I use the term innovationist because I believe in growth, and I believe that human beings have creative power that no other species has, and that it is human creativity and brilliance, that is the driving force of history. And so innovationism is kind of the new stage of anti-imperialism that the Center for Political Innovation is espousing at this time. Marxism is definitely there. It is something that is an influence on us, etc. However, I think it's time to move on from Marxism in general because the anti-imperialist countries have largely moved on from classical Marxism. And Marxism in the West has become completely toxic.
Now, before I hand this over to Keith, you had a very thoughtful introduction here, Caleb, and I want to jump on something before we forget this. A lot of your analysis now sounds like a lot of stuff I heard from libertarian socialists. And are you influenced by Wittel's idea of the hydraulic empire thesis?
Never heard of that.
Really?
Yeah, tell me about it. I'm not familiar at all.
So Wittel was a Western Marxist who was living, I think, in the United States. He was initially a Stalinist, and then he realized that in around the third millennium BC, you have Egypt, Babylon, China, and India all developing empires around river systems. And now he argues that the Soviet Empire under Stalin, at least Stalin, maybe before, represented an recasting of that concept in modern times. You could also include Maoist China. And so he viewed that as a regression from socialism because that's going back to the earliest civilization.
Well, I mean, that sounds similar to what I have read. I mean, it's similar in a way because it's arguing about land masses to what I increasingly give a lot of credibility to Alexander Dugin, the thinker in Russia, who I have met. And, immediately after I met him, oh, my God, you're a fascist. I mean, it's weird how much. I mean, and they murdered his daughter. I met his daughter. I only met him once. I met his daughter a number of times when I was in Russia. And her death was certainly a shock to me when I heard about it. I mean, a very brutal killing that happened at the hands of the NATO-backed Ukrainian ultranationalist elements. And Alexander Dugin talks about civilizations of the land and civilizations of the sea. thalassocracy and tujurocracy, I believe, or turigocracy. And he argues that if you look at ancient empires that were based on the land, they had to develop, because in order to bring great land masses together on the land, you have to build roads and you have to have some kind of development. Whereas sea-based empires, it's more like you just control the routes, right? You just have your ships and you make sure everyone has to go through you, and you control the trade routes. And so sea-based empires concentrate the wealth in mighty cities and hold back development, whereas land-based empires develop and bring regions together by raising living standards and increasing development. And that, like, the Chinese civilization was an empire of the land, the Russian Empire is an empire of the land, whereas the Roman Empire, and most specifically the British Empire, is an empire of the sea. And that empires of the sea are more collectivist, or empires of the land are more collectivist. Civilizations of the sea, empires of the sea, are more individualist, and that this is something that plays out. Increasingly, I tell people, Lenin's theory of imperialism was the first understanding of imperialism that I ever had. I studied Lenin's understanding of the export of capital and corporations spreading their tentacles across the planet, holding back development, finance capital and bankers becoming dominant over industry, carving out spheres of influence, the emergence of an international financial oligarchy. That's Lenin. But before Lenin, you had Henry Charles Carey in America, and he was an advisor to Abraham Lincoln, and he wrote about the American system versus the English system. And what he wrote about the English system is very similar to what Lenin wrote about imperialism. He describes the English system as dominating the trade routes, underworking the Hindu, and driving the rest of humanity down to his level. Malthusianism, he argues, depopulation. He argues all of that is the English system, and it's so English corporations can dominate the world by holding back development. And in opposition to that, he put forward the American system, which later, those were the economic ideas of Friedrich List, the kind of German nationalist who was kind of considered a rival of Marx, along with the socialist Eugen Düring, who Engels wrote his big book Anti-Düring against, right? And that they developed a socialism based on what they called the harmony of interests of a nation, as opposed to class struggle. But it was still kind of describing a similar thing, and they called out the English system. And when Lenin developed his theory of imperialism, he's kind of almost echoing what Henry Charles Carey and Friedrich List wrote about the English system. And then on top of that, I take Dugin's understanding of Eurasianism or continentalism versus Atlanticism. And I think all of them are pointing toward the same thing. We live under this empire that holds back development, that is trying to reduce the population in order to concentrate wealth into mighty cities, trading hubs, and they are trying to hold back human progress, and that's what we're against. And whether it's imperialism or the English system or Atlanticism, it's all basically the same thing. We can see this enemy, and we can see the forces around the world rising against it because they want development.
All right, Keith, have we got any questions for Caleb?
Yeah, there's a lot to discuss here. I remember a while back, Caleb, you were posting things on X or Twitter or whatever it was called at the time, talking about this kind of false pseudo-socialism that you see among these Western leftists who are really just basically radical liberals, or I don't even know how radical they are. But you were contrasting that with what you argued was true socialism, and you would give examples like the Chinese model, what they call socialism with Chinese characteristics. And you also talked about Gaddafi, Ba'athist socialism, Iranian Islamic socialism, Bolivarian socialism in South America, the Sandinistas. I think their slogan is what? Solidarity, Christianity, and socialism. All of these different kinds of models. But what I thought was interesting about that was that it reminded me of a couple of things from years ago. Back in the late 1980s, I first started to encounter the European third positionists, including groups like the English National Front, which at the time had moved in a very left direction from what they were more known for before, when Martin Webster was their leader. And they started to develop a sort of revolutionary nationalist outlook. And back then they were saying, well, we're revolutionary nationalists. We're not communists, but we're not capitalists either. and we identify with national revolutionaries in the global south, or that would have been called the third world back then. But and they would specifically identify figures like Gaddafi, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the original Ayatollah from the 1979 revolution. Also, many third world insurgent forces, also figures like Juan Perón. They identified all of these as national revolutionaries. And then overlapping with this viewpoint, you see a range of other viewpoints, some of which started drifting towards national Bolshevism. Alexander Dugin, I think, was a part of that initially. I think he's moved away from it. Also, Edward Limonov initially, and then I think he's deceased now, but he eventually started moving more of in a pro-Western direction. But you had national Bolshevism. You also had left-wing national socialism, like figures that they would identify with figures like the Strasser brothers. And they would say, well, the problem with the Third Reich, one of the problems with it is that it actually betrayed National Socialism, that Hitler was a right-wing capitalist. But I do remember when I started seeing some of your ideas, thinking this sounds an awful lot like this older third position model I remember from years ago. But also, I do remember hearing a lecture or seeing a lecture from Michael Parenti, circa 1990-91, which I'm sure you're familiar with Parenti, but he made a similar argument, though, from a Marxist perspective, where he was saying that the problem that Western capitalism has with figures like Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, the Iranians, the Syrians, the recently deposed regime in Syria, the Sandinistas, is that those are all developmentalist regimes. Like the core feature of, whether it's the Cubans, whether it's the Nicaraguans, whether it's the Vietnamese, whether it's the Iranians, is that they are big on development in the sense of, electrification or literacy programs or, improved health programs, all of these different kinds of features that contribute to development, irrespective of their other policies. Whereas the goal of Western imperialism is to ensure that all of these different kinds of states remain subjugated to this kind of subordination to these colonialist international trade cartels that are rooted in traditional colonialism. But how would you differentiate your viewpoint, say, from third positionism? Because a lot of times third positionism is labeled as a form of fascism, and sometimes it arguably is a form of fascism, although it depends on how you define fascism, and that gets into some other thorny questions as well. What's your general feeling about this?
Well, before I answer that, Keith, I want to say I love your work. I have a copy of Thinkers Against Modernity, and I really learned a lot from it. So, it's really an honor to be able to engage with you here. I do appreciate you, and I read attackthesystem.com. You have good observations from many different sections of the political sphere. So I just want to make that clear. We issued CPI, Center for Political Innovation. We issued our own edition of Frederick Engels' book, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. And I wrote a very long introduction to it. And in that introduction, I argue that there are really what we call socialism. It can really be divided. There are three socialist movements that have existed in history. The first one was Marxism. And Marxism really has developed into social democracy, right? And if you look at AOC, and if you look at, Keir Starmer in Britain, and you look at the World Economic Forum, and if you look at H.G. Wells and his writing, Marxism was originally the ideology of the labor movement, in Western countries, fighting for things like the 8-hour workday, fighting for, things like kindergartens. And as Western capitalism moved toward the stage of imperialism, a big section of the richest of the rich realized that social democracy, which is what it was called. Marxism was called social democracy. The German Social Democratic Party was the Marxist party. Like Engels helped found it. Marx's critique of the Goethe program was a critique of their original manifesto. The German Social Democratic Party, which was the flagship Marxist party in the world, was very useful in helping German imperialism because the Kaiser, he needed soldiers to go around and fight. So setting up kindergartens where all the kids could go to kindergarten and learn to march from the time they were little kids, that helped set up the army. And that, the Kaiser in Germany, he created a national health service because he wanted his population to be strong so they could go out and build a mighty army. And he wanted to centralize the healthcare system for strategic reasons. And that social democracy turned into a mechanism for making Western countries more stable so the ultra corporations there could colonize the world, right? And that Western civilization would have fallen apart if you didn't have things like the 8-hour workday. And if you didn't have these things, Cecil Rhodes, who Zimbabwe used to be called Rhodesia, it was named after him. He's quoted as saying, he was in the East End of London one day and he went to a meeting of the unemployed workers and he listened to their wild speeches and they were all a cry for bread, bread, bread. And that in order to avoid a civil war, it was necessary for Britain to become imperialist, and that social democracy and imperialism kind of walked hand in hand as kind of an evolution of the Western societies into imperialism. So Marxism and the legacy of that continues. Liberalism, social democracy, this is the legacy. This is what Karl Marx's movement got watered down into. You remember Karl Marx supported the British colonizing India because he said, hey, Britain's advanced and capitalist, and they'll bring some of that advanced capitalism to India. Karl Marx supported the USA seizing Texas from Mexico. And said that America was a more advanced country and they would bring their advanced country. And Engels disagreed with him and said, well, actually, it's the slave system that's being exported. And so, Engels and Marx disagreed about that. But Marx was very much of the belief that the West was the most advanced. Germany, Britain, France, they were the most advanced countries in the world, and that they were going to take over the whole world and create one global economy. And Marx did believe in free trade. He was opposed to any tariffs or any protectionism, and they were going to spread this great capitalist system all over the world, and that would create a working class, and then the workers would get more politically active, and that would lead to some kind of revolution. And social democracy kind of turned into a method for stabilizing capitalism. So that was the first socialist movement. The second socialist movement is, there was this guy, Eugen Düring, who was like the big rival of Marx and Engels. He was a professor who lived in Berlin, in Germany, and he believed in socialism on a nationalist basis, right? And he was tied in with Friedrich List and with Henry Charles Carey, and he argued that instead of class struggle, you should develop what he called a harmony of interests for the whole nation. And fascism, National Socialism, is very much kind of a continuity of those ideas. The idea that we'll have a state that controls the economy so that we can build a mighty empire, so we can stabilize capitalism in the interest of the whole nation. And that both Marxism and then later National Socialism or fascism, neither of them ever created a non-capitalist society. Social democracy, it has been a very effective mechanism for creating imperialism around the world and stabilizing the Western imperialist homelands. National Socialism or fascism was a mechanism for beating back the danger of revolution and stabilizing and militarizing societies in the 1930s. It led to World War II. They didn't last very long. But I would argue that what started with Lenin in 1917 and has continued to evolve with Stalin, with Deng Xiaoping, with Baathism, with Bolivarian socialism, is a third movement that is neither National Socialism and fascism or classical Marxism. And it's really not. It originally claimed Marxist roots, but Lenin knew very, very well he was doing something different. And people don't realize that the Bolsheviks were considered freaks. They were not accepted among the general Marxist movement. Bolshevism was decried as being undemocratic, as being a monastic order rather than a political party, as being some kind of weird Eastern sect. And the Bolsheviks were not considered to be in the mainstream of Marxism at the time that they came to power. They were considered to be this weird Russian cult by some weird Russian guy who had developed his own method. And Trotsky didn't join the Bolsheviks until the last minute because he was more in line with the European Marxist movement. And he didn't join them until July of 1917. And then he eventually left them, and his theory of permanent revolution was that communism must spread to the West because the West is the best and the West is the only place that it counts. And when it became clear the Soviet Union wasn't going to, have an all-out crusade to march communism into Europe, Trotsky was out of there, right? And socialism in one country that Stalin developed was an even further deviation from what Marx developed. And I would argue that what has come into being now, this third form of socialism, that is neither Marxist or Düringist or nationalist. This new form that we can argue that Dugin has talked about the fourth political theory in China. They talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics. I don't know what it is, but it's new and it's exciting, and that is the future of the world. And what defines it is its pro-economic growth. It is about economic growth. These countries have been kept in poverty by the domination of Western corporations, and they want to grow, right? And that social democracy used to want that, but now social democracy, especially now, is really pushing degrowth. And fascism was always about degrowth. It was about, kind of creating a slave labor underclass, militarizing the economy to kind of reboot with degrowth, and that this third form of socialism, the essence of it is wanting economic development and wanting to raise living standards and increase productive forces, which is the urgent need of these countries. And that the way socialism came into the world, the only real socialism that we've seen, the only real non-capitalist economies we've ever seen, have come in the colonized world as a result of fighting against imperialism. Social democracy never created a non-capitalist society, and neither did fascism. It's only been this third form that has created it. And this third form needs to be understood as something new. And I believe it will come to the first world because, yes, there was a time where Western imperialism was kind of benefiting us here in America. We were bombing and destroying other countries and keeping them poor, but we got houses and cars and TV sets. And at least white Americans, we were doing okay. That's ancient history. And ultimately, we're battling against the same global system. And so, as far as I certainly don't view this as a continuity of fascism. I argued, I debated one of these guys, Cultured Thug, who's one of these guys, and he was saying he admired Mussolini and he admired Gaddafi. And I said, you can't do that because Gaddafi, his whole, onus was he comes out of the movement of Omar Mukhtar, right? The Libyan revolution was a fight against Italian fascism. The Italians colonized Libya and were brutally oppressing it. And Omar Mukhtar led an uprising of the Libyan people against it. And that was Gaddafi's hero. And he would wear a necklace with the face of Omar Mukhtar on it. And the essence of fascism, if you will, National Socialism, Italian fascism, it was always pro-imperialism and pro-colonization. It was Germany and Italy were imperialist countries that had been stripped of their colonies, that had been weakened, and they created this heavy-handed nationalistic militarist movement to restore their ability to be colonizers. And they openly stated that, and they had kind of romanticized the notion of empire. They wanted to restore the Roman Empire or create like a great German empire or something like that. And so it could never really be against imperialism because it strove to be imperialist. Whatever anti-capitalist or deeply conservative pretensions that it had, it was trying to kind of bring back the imagery and aesthetics of feudalism while at the same time trying to restore some kind of empire. So I don't see a continuity in what's happening around the world with fascism, though I will admit it's not really a continuity of classical Marxism either. It's something completely new, and we should speak of it in this sense.
So I have a point I want to maybe recast to see what you think. So you're talking about this fourth, well, loosely we'll call it the fourth position Duginism, loosely. Now this is anachronistic, and I don't mean to make a one-to-one juxtaposition here, but I think you could actually argue that Wilhelmine Germany and the Marxist party there, the reformists under Bernstein, were actually the cutting edge of socialism at the time. And why I'm saying this is because we have Robert Engdahl's Oil Wars, where he talks about how Germany was internally developing Turkey to build railroads and, well, the Ottoman Empire at the time, and to exploit oil reserves, obviously for their own benefit, but also Turkey's. Britain didn't want to share. Britain wanted to blow up the whole Middle East to make sure that if I couldn't get the oil, nobody can, right? And so furthermore, it was the German banking system that was opposed to the sort of, Glass-Steagall type radical investment of England and America. The idea of Mittel Europa is sort of like a economic commons for Europe, which, most other countries, we forget this. In World War I, most other European countries were pro-German. Switzerland was pro-German. Denmark, Scandinavia, Sweden, and Norway were pro-German. Spain was pro-German. In fact, Spain was so pro-German in the past that's why the Franco-Prussian War happened. They were afraid they'd be surrounded again. So Napoleon III starts upping the ante here. And also, there was a documentary I watched, which I can't remember now, unfortunately, about U.S. labor history. And it compared the deaths per 100,000 on the job, workplace deaths in like 1900 or something. Germany had the lowest of all industrialized countries. They had the lowest on-the-job death, and America had the highest. And I'm like, well, okay, yeah, sure, there's the Wilhelmine Germany, there's the Junkers, but socialism has to come out of something. It has to come out of something. So I think one way to recast World War I is that Germany was targeted by the Atlantic powers because they perceived it as a nascent socialist threat. What would you say to that?
I wouldn't agree with that it was a nascent socialist threat. I would argue that German imperialism was very late coming on the scene, and there was a very, very big and powerful labor movement in Germany. The Marxist party the German Social Democratic Party was like the flagship Marxist party. And so as they were an up-and-coming imperialist power, they had to make more concessions to the working class, and that also made them a more effective. I mean, they had kindergartens and public education in Germany before we had it in America. And you can read the articles in the American press where they're saying things to the effect of, geez, the Kaiser is giving all the kids military training in school. We need to do the same thing over here if we're going to beat him. There has been a long-standing rivalry between the European mainland and the British and Americans. And that is that World War I and World War II are that, right? It's that rivalry. The British and the Americans have long sought to exert dominance over the European mainland. And that also brings me to another point, which is that leftist politics, especially we're talking like 1900, it was thoroughly infiltrated by every side, right? I mean, the British were funding various revolutionary movements for their own ends. The Germans were funding various revolutionary movements for their own ends. And that it was discovered, when you talk about counter gangs and all of that, that radical intellectual groups that would carry out assassinations, would carry out bombings, would organize strikes and protests, were very useful in intelligence schemes, right? And that they existed for that purpose. Leon Trotsky admits that his theory of permanent revolution was invented by Alexander Parvus. Alexander Parvus was a member of the German parliament from the Social Democratic Party, and he was an arms dealer. He sold weapons to Turkey on behalf of the Germans, and he was an arms dealer. And Alexander Parvus, he was this very, very wealthy guy who was a socialist member of parliament, and we now know he was a German intelligence officer. Well, the theory of permanent revolution, a big part of it, at least in the early 1900s, was calling for the creation of a European Union, the United States of Europe, it was called. And Trotsky went around urging socialists all over Europe and all over the Western world to call for the creation of a United States of Europe. Lenin said, no, we don't want a United States of Europe, because if all the imperialist colonizers in Europe get together, that'll strengthen their power and they'll be able to exploit the third world more. We don't want that. But Trotsky went around advocating the creation of the United States of Europe, which would have strengthened the position of German imperialism, right? The British were always trying to divide the European mainland so that they could have dominance. And the Germans were always trying to kind of solidify Belgium and Luxembourg and France and all of them into one state and coordinate more effectively. So Trotsky was clearly acting as an asset at that point of German imperialism. Now, we know later Parvus is the guy who arranged for Lenin to return to Russia at the time of the Russian Revolution, right? Because Lenin was anti-war. He wanted Russia to pull out of World War I, and he had this mass organization. So Parvus, on behalf of German intelligence, went to Lenin and said, look, here's some money. We don't know how much. It's undisclosed. And they arranged for him to be put on a sealed train and sent back to Russia in the middle of the revolutionary crisis, in the hopes that he would, push Russia to withdraw from the war. And that to think that those are the only people that were under the influence of intelligence agency is utter delusion. I mean, it's been proven the British were backing all kinds of radical movements in Italy, all kinds of radical movements, and that these kind of organizations become a very effective vehicle for getting things done. And often, the art of intelligence is often getting people to do things without realizing they're being used. They say you're an asset in intelligence terms, not when you're willingly working for the intelligence agency, but when they can predict your behavior enough to know what you're going to do, right? And that these revolutionary student groups, I mean, we've all seen like Les Miserables. Do you hear the people say? Those guys, kids with red flags in the pubs, those kinds of groups of like young men who believed in freedom and wanted bloodshed and wanted revenge and were very much motivated by a desire to unleash their rage and their sexual passion and were kind of raging at the conservative society around them. They were very useful hit squads for various different forces. And I think that can't be ignored. And that's something that we kind of gloss over when we read the revolutionary history. We just read the printed words and what they were arguing about. In reality, there were bigger forces that were kind of using all these different groups as puppets to serve different agendas.
Real quick, before I hand this over to Keith, we just got a super chat. It's very apropos to our discussion. Reestablishment for $5. Thank you very much. Bismarck understood the necessity of stabilizing the core society due to the lateness of German imperialism. So yeah, I guess that's
That's what I was saying. Yeah, I think, and social democracy, you could not have imperialism without social democracy. If there's not class peace at home, you can't conquer the rest of the world. So, yeah.
Okay, Keith, do you have any questions?
Well, this is something of a follow-up on what Todd was discussing earlier about the Witful Go Thesis. For those who don't know who Witful Go was, he was a former Marxist, and he was a historian writing in the 1950s. And he offered a critique of what he called Oriental societies, which in modern terminology would just mean Asian or Eurasian societies. But he argued that in those kinds of societies, there emerged a type of despotism that he thought was rooted in economic development through hydraulic systems that were heavily dependent on irrigation, and that these kinds of systems required massive bureaucracies that dominated social life in a wider sense, as opposed to the seafaring peoples that you typically find in more Western societies, like coming out of the British Isles and all of that. And Witful Go argued that models of this kind of society from history were places like ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Hellenistic Greece, Rome, the Abbasid Caliphate, Imperial China, the Mongol Empire, and then places like Inca and Peru. And he also considered the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China to be, while not necessarily hydraulic empires, they were manifestations of this kind of Asiatic despotism that he thought characterized these older models of society. And I ask about this for two reasons. First, I've heard Haz al-Din make a similar argument, where he argues that places like the Ottoman Empire or Muscovite Russia or certain phases in China's, in pre-modern China's history, were all prototypes for socialism, even if they're not modern forms of socialism. And he was comparing this with the kind of models that Western style socialists claim today, like Swedish social democracy or anarchist Catalonia or California or somewhere like that. Would you agree with that thesis? Do you think there's any merit in it?
There's certainly merit in it. I don't fully agree, but I would say, when we talk about the West versus the East, in the East, they talk about filial piety, right? And that, like, for example, Singapore is not a socialist country. It's a capitalist country, but there is heavy state involvement. It's a very state-run economy. And that very much emerged in Singapore because the culture could allow for such a thing, right? And that, if you look at like the Asian tiger countries, like Park Chung-hee's South Korea, Singapore, the government on Taiwan prior to democratization, those were not socialist countries, but they kind of shared the aesthetic that you see in communist governments, right? You have the leader's picture on the wall. There's kind of, people are kind of looking up to the leader and trying to please the leader rather than the leader trying to entertain them and get their votes. It's like the people are expected to perform and please the leader, not the leader trying to please the people. That's very much a Confucian, like filial kind of thing, like the students trying to please the teacher, the parent trying to, or the child trying to please their parent, not the other way around. So you have more of a conservative traditionalist way in the East that made, what Stalin developed, which had a big influence of that as well, made what Stalin developed, much more easy to swallow and much more effective to set up in the East, right? And that the East never had become fully capitalist. These were largely feudal societies that their way of industrializing was having a socialist revolution. But there are weird things like that too. For example, in Japan and in Korea and in China, you notice that there were peasant uprisings in the name of Christianity. In Japan, I think it was like as soon as the Spanish missionaries showed up, you had this rebellion where the peasantry, they read the Bible and they're like, oh, the last shall be first, the first shall be last. And then all of a sudden the peasants were rising up in Japan and killing their landlords in the name of Christianity. In the 1800s in China, you had the Taiping Uprising, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, where again, it was like one guy read one pamphlet that had been translated into Chinese. And he's like, oh, well, I'm actually Jesus's younger brother and the peasants are going to rise up and we're going to build a socialist God kingdom on earth. And similar events happened in Korea. And that, there was kind of a tradition that lended itself more toward building some kind of egalitarian movement and in opposition to the kind of individualistic Western societies that developed in the West, right? That the capitalism in the West developed out of feudalism, and that what we think of as left, and this is a really important point, what we think of as leftism is really the ideals of the bourgeois capitalist revolution. The French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, the red flag. I mean, it was originally a red cap, the sans culotte, the poor peasants wore a red cap, and that red was their rage and the blood of the monarchs that they were going to kill. And the French Revolution was an explosion, this very conservative feudal society where one could be executed for adultery, and peasants were not allowed to look their landlord in the face because and they had different words designating your social rank, and he and thee, etc. Well, as capitalism is emerging, as you have the new mercantile class, they need to rip up feudalism so that they can have dominance, and so they go out and they tell everyone, let all your anger out, let all your rage come out. There is no God, there is no religion, don't obey, do whatever you want, it is right to rebel. And they create a social explosion where everyone's rage comes out and they tear down feudalism. And that movement, that was not a movement to create socialism, that was a movement to bring capitalism into power over the ruins of feudalism. But that's what left is. And that's why red is a color of rage and sexual passion. That's what it is. And left has become synonymous with releasing your impulses. And that's, if you're going to tear apart a feudal society, that's what you want everyone to do. Feudalism is a society where everyone kind of bottles it in all the time. And you want to overthrow feudalism, you just tell everyone to let it all out. I believe the Marquis de Sade even said that to keep the passion of the French Revolution going, he wanted theaters with naked women on display, so men could go look at the naked women, and that would inflame their passion for the French Revolution. That shows you how much the French Revolution was very much a sexual revolution. It was very much about libidinal release, libido. Sigmund Freud said, rage and the desire for aggression and sex are connected, and that leftism is very much tapping into people's libido and unleashing it for political ends. And communism around the world is not left anymore. In fact, it's quite conservative, right? If you look at what communism is around the world, it's saying we're going to protect you from the chaos of Western society. In the West, people are unemployed. In the West, we have, gender confusion and people don't know who they are and the family's falling apart. But with our socialist planned economy, we will protect you from the instability of the West. And it's almost conservative, right? And you saw the beginning of that with Stalin and the Soviet family. And in China now, especially with, it's weird because, Mao hated Confucius. But now in China, there's a revival of Confucian thought. At the same time, there's a revival of Mao Zedong thought. And they kind of walk hand in hand as part of China's unique identity that is not Western, right? Mao is a collectivist communist. Confucius is a traditionalist, advocate of feudalism. But they both are part of China's unique identity that is not Western. And that is what is rising around the world, is this kind of opposition to Western liberalism, which is radical individualism above all else, postmodernism, a belief that there is no real truth. And it's kind of a revolt against that as societies say, no, we don't want to embrace the lassitude that's spreading throughout the West.
So, Caleb, we have another super chat, but a question I think directed at you. I want to get to it before we move on too far from his question. This is from Ryan Young, and this is referring to your Dugan distinction between land and sea empires. He says, do the people in the sea power see themselves as this characterization? Not saying that it doesn't play out that way. So he's asking you, do they see themselves in that light, or is that something that is they're not aware of?
Well, I think it's the values that the society extols. There are obviously people. I'm here in the United States, and I very much feel that America is a country of the land. I very much consider the American Revolution to be a rejection of the British Empire and Atlanticism. But I would say the values in American media and American education are largely Atlanticist values. But I can be in opposition to it. I think it's more the idea that the society puts out ideas that are going to hold it together on behalf of the ruling elite. The values that are put out in Western society tend to be radical individualist ideas. The values put out in Eastern land-based societies tend to be more collectivist ideas.
Okay, now there's another question directed at me, so I better answer this before we move on. Ryan Young as well. I have another question. If Germany was targeted over socialism, why was the USSR an ally in World War II? So he's saying Germany in World War I, riffing off my recasting of Wilhelmine Germany. And I would say the reason why the USSR was an ally in World War II was because, in part, It was a asset of the deep state. It was a counter gang. And yeah, that's my answer to Ryan Young. So Keith, actually, no, Keith, you just asked the question. I wanted to ask you, Caleb, for innovationism, for those that don't know about it, you already sort of gave a brief introduction. Could you describe the theory and praxis that drives innovationism?
Okay, well, the main thing is that, if you read Marx, right, Marx refers to human beings as being an animal because that was the way people talked. And Marx, had correspondence with Charles Darwin, and they were rejecting any form of spirituality. They were hard materialists. Man was just another animal. But there's a very important essay that Frederick Engels wrote called The Role of Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man. And in that essay, Frederick Engels points out that human beings are unlike any other species because all other species simply interact with their environment, but human beings master their environment and force the environment to serve them, and that human labor power is about mastering the environment. And the whole history of human civilization, we have been reinventing our relationship with nature constantly in order to have a longer life expectancy, in order to increase our population, in order to have a more comfortable life. And we are constantly reinventing our relationship with nature. We're constantly innovating. And Marx touches on this. And his understanding of historical materialism is like, first you have hunter-gatherer civilization, eventually you have slavery, eventually you have feudalism, and then feudalism gives rise to industrial capitalism, which gives rise to imperialism, eventually socialism and communism. So he's understanding that that's the nature of humanity. But his focus is on the struggle between the industrial factory worker and the industrial factory owner. Well, nowadays, we live in a world where artificial intelligence is very rapidly eliminating human labor, right? Human labor has less and less of a role at the assembly line. Workers are more and more alienated from each other. Meanwhile, what Marx wrote about the contradiction between, what really, and this is the essence of what Marx wrote about. If you read, Capital, if you read The Poverty of Philosophy, he was talking about capitalism is the only system in history that has created poverty caused by abundance, right? Never before have people been homeless because there are too many houses. Never before have people been hungry because there's too much food. Capitalism creates a situation where the more wealth that is created, the poorer people get. And great technological advances make the problem worse because, self-driving cars should be a great thing. It should be great to have self-driving cars. But in our society, it would lead to millions of unemployed truck drivers, millions of unemployed Uber drivers, millions of unemployed state highway patrolmen and traffic court employees. And what sense does that make? It should be great that there's less human labor that's necessary because this chore called driving, is no longer necessary. And so abundance creating poverty, that is the essential contradiction of capitalism, that human brilliance, eliminating labor, making human labor more productive because machines can do so much and we have to do so little, that should lead to vast abundance. And that ultimately points toward the necessity of creating a rationally organized economy so that human creativity can continue to soar forward and we can become wealthier as technology advances. And that's at the essence of what Marx wrote, but in his time, it had not fully developed to the point that it has developed now. Marx was talking about the struggle of the factory worker against the factory owner, but he was pointing to something that was even deeper than that, which is that contradiction between human creativity, etc., and how ultimately the necessity of the capitalist economic system and the drive for technology is going to be a rationally organized economy. That's the ultimate conclusion. Now, Nelson Peary, who was the leader of the Communist Labor Party, and eventually formed the League of Revolutionaries for a New America, he wrote a very, very good book before he died, which I really recommend to people. It's called The Future is Up to Us. And in this book, he points out that the worker and the factory owner, they are both part of capitalism. But the merchant class that overthrew feudalism, they were neither slaves or serfs or landowners. And they were a new class that had been created by the rise of a new mode of production of capitalism. And that the landowners that overthrew hunter-gatherer civilization, they were not part of hunter-gatherer civilization. They had land. They were a separate new class that had been created for a new mode of production. And what he argues is that it's not, the working class is an essential part of capitalism, the wage worker. It's not a class within the system that overthrows it. It is a new class created by a new mode of production. And what Nelson Peary argues is that capitalism, through the computer revolution, through artificial intelligence, is creating what he calls the new class of almost permanently unemployed workers that are almost like gig economy workers who are struggling every day to survive and are kind of small business owners. You know, they work, they set their own hours, and they kind of have to use their creativity and their innovation to figure out how they can hustle as much money from Uber or from Amazon or whoever in order to get by. That new class that has been created that really doesn't have a place in capitalism is kind of fighting every day to just have enough. They're not lumpen. They're not criminal elements that are leeching off their own class. They're like fighting to just get enough to survive as they've kind of been cast out of the means of production. That new class, the precariat is what other people have come to call it. That new class will lay the basis for a new economy when society controls the means of production. And I've pointed to the rise of Javier Milei in Argentina. Awful leader. He has been awful for Argentina, but why did he win? He won because the left, the socialist movement in Argentina, the labor unions, the communist groups are very much tied in with the Peronist bureaucracy. And that Peronist bureaucracy crushes gig economy workers, right? They get treated as small business owners. Their taxes are what they would pay if they were a small business owner. They don't get union representation. And gig economy workers in Argentina have been royally screwed by the Peronist bureaucracy. If they were factory workers, they would benefit from the Peronist bureaucracy. But because they're gig economy workers, they have been totally screwed. And so libertarianism is much more attractive to them, right? I believe Javier Milei has gotten rid of a lot of the licenses that they have to pay, has lifted a lot of the taxes on them. And so the libertarian philosophy very much appeals to the precariat because the bureaucracy is intended to protect factory workers. And that Marxism and socialism was always intended to be a labor union adjacent movement. That's how Marx designed it. Social democracy originally, communism, Bolshevism was like the anti-imperialist wing of the labor movement, but it was always designed to be there are workers in this factory that are organized into this union to demand better conditions, and this is the ideology of the labor union. This is the ideology and the political vision that accompanies the labor movement. We're in a period where the labor movement, it's still a factor, but it's very different. And so we have to kind of rethink things. And that's why innovationism is a celebration of human creativity, an understanding that we need a rationally organized economy, and that the computer revolution has created a deep crisis of overproduction. And that ultimately, I have raised the slogan, we need a government of action to fight for working families, right? We need a state that controls the economy in order to make sure there is growth. But there's going to be a lot of capitalists in that state. And if you look at any 21st century socialist society, all the actual communist governments have realized in order to have communism or socialism in our time, you need small business owners. And in fact, in Nicaragua, micro entrepreneurship is a big part. That's the success. The government loans money to Nicaraguans to start their own farm, to start their own business. And that's how it's flourished. In China, it's the same thing. And in Vietnam, it's the same thing. And North Korea would like to do that. It's just very difficult because of all the sanctions. Right? Capitalism is an essential part of 21st century socialism. It's just controlled. It's not capitalism in the sense that profits are in command, but having a market sector and having innovators, people that are entrepreneurs with new ideas that go out and invent things, having consumers vote with their dollars on things. That's a part of the 21st century pro-growth, state-planned economies that are emerging, right? So by calling us innovationists, we're making clear we are not anti-growth. We're not opposed to creativity. We're not trying to, impose some kind of bureaucracy on working people. We want a state that controls the major centers of economic power to enable people to go out and innovate and be creative and build a new, beautiful world with their minds and with their creative power, right? It's a different kind of relationship. We need a state that is actively investing in the population and sees human labor power as the source of all wealth, and human creativity as something that needs to be nurtured and promoted at all costs.
Okay, Keith, do you have any follow-up questions?
That part of the discussion leads into some other questions I had that I think are highly relevant to this. There was a British writer, a professor of literature, that back in the 90s published a work called The Lost Literature of Socialism. George Watson was his name. And he went back and he reviewed a lot of the work of early socialists from, say, the mid to late 19th century, perhaps even earlier than that, primarily English socialists, but figures like John Ruskin, George Bernard Shaw, William Morris, writers in that vein, as well as Marx and others. And the conclusion that Watson came to from reading a lot of that old early socialist literature was that socialism initially had been essentially a somewhat conservative movement, in the sense that it was a reaction against the social dislocation that was generated by the Industrial Revolution, by urbanization, by the Enlightenment, classical liberalism, capitalism, all of these things that characterized the 19th century. And in fact, even if you read Marx in the Communist Manifesto, it's either the second or third chapter, but Marx is talking about all of these different types of socialism. There's feudal socialism, there's bourgeois socialism, there's clerical socialism, utopian socialism. This kind of stuff was all over the place in the 19th century. But it's interesting that what has come to be identified with socialism in Western countries is not really all of that. Instead, it's this kind of cultural left that we've been discussing, which is this kind of nihilist framework that in many ways in past times was associated with things like aristocratic decadence and bourgeois decadence. For instance, if you go back and you read social critics from past times, what is the stereotype of, say, the homosexual or the transvestite, or somebody, or the opium addict? It's these are always considered manifestations of bourgeois decadence or aristocratic decadence. And also, what's interesting is that from reading my book Thinkers Against Modernity, that a lot of these old school reactionaries actually had a lot of interest in the things that are definitive of the left today, things like drugs, sexual experimentation, the occult, Eastern mysticism, all of that kind of stuff that closely resembles the age of Aquarius, say from the 60s and 70s. And that has come to really define a substantial part of the Western left. In addition to this kind of nihilism that you see derivative from the French Revolution, this idea, that in order to build something, you've got to first destroy something. And that, which I think is in many ways a departure, certainly from the kind of socialism you've been talking about. And I think probably what early socialism involved. As an interesting aside to that, Murray Rothbard, who was a pioneer anarcho-capitalist, who in economics terms would be considered extreme right-wing, probably kind of like Javier Milei. But interestingly, though, Rothbard's view of communism was not the standard American John Bircher view of communism. He actually believed that communism is historically progressive because he thought it was having the effect of eradicating feudalism and bringing the pre-modern countries into modernity, in the sense that it's lifting them out of feudalism and into a modern, post-enlightenment, science and rationality-based culture, which in his opinion, he thought would eventually yield to the total free market, utopia that he envisioned, anarcho-capitalism. But I think he was partially right in the sense that there was, I think that's one of the, if you look at the historic impact of Asian communism, that was one of its key contributions, is that it eradicated feudalism and quasi-feudal-like systems all over the world. Now that leads into my question, which is I find your approach to class analysis to be very interesting, because you're actually influenced by Carl Ogilvy's idea of the Yankee Cowboy War. And many years ago, when looking at political conflict in the United States and class conflict in the United States, I came to the idea, well, it looks like a lot of this stuff has to do with the traditional Northeastern-based ruling class versus the Sun Belt, versus the industrial capitalist that he developed across the Midwest and the South and the West in the 20th century as industrialization, and then the military-industrial complex and all of that emerged. And it looked like starting in the mid-20th century, that became the real fundamental political conflict in America. It was no longer the North versus the South. It was the Northeast versus the Sun Belt, with California kind of working both ends at various times. And that was the Oglesby thesis. And I also know, I didn't know at the time that Carl Oglesby had developed this thesis, but then I was pleased to find somebody else that already thought about this. And then when I heard you mention Oglesby, I was like, yeah, somebody else is paying attention to this idea. And I've seen Michael Lind and Joel Kotkin and some other more mainstream social scientists talk about this as well. But how does this idea of the Yankee Cowboy War inform your approach to class analysis? Because it, I think, impacts a lot of your other ideas. For instance, in the previous election, you seem to be taking the position that the Republicans were actually the lesser evil, or Trump was a lesser evil than the Harris and the Democrats. But what's the analytical framework you're drawing on and the rationale behind these positions?
Well, it's interesting because I've been thinking about this for a long time. In around the time of the 2008 financial crash, that's when I really started to understand the economics of capitalism. Fred Goldstein wrote a book called Low Wage Capitalism and went on a speaking tour, and I studied that book, and I studied Engels, and I studied William C. Foster and his big histories. And the more I read about the Russian Revolution, about the Chinese Revolution, and even about the civil rights movement and about the 1930s and the rise of Roosevelt and the labor movement, the more I realized that the precursor to any big revolutionary movement, whether it's successful or not, has always been a divide in the ruling class, right? It's been a division in the ruling class. Roosevelt was fighting with the National Association of Manufacturers. That caused him to align himself with the labor unions and, et cetera. The civil rights movement was supported by like the northern wing of the Democratic Party, the Kennedy family, and there was a division over how to address the issue of Jim Crow because the Soviet Union was using it against the United States. The Russian Revolution, there was a difference within the ruling class. Firstly, because the Tsar was viewed as incompetent. He was losing the war. Secondly, whether they should stay in the war at all. There was a big section of the Russian ruling class that wanted to do business with Germany and didn't consider Germany its enemy. And that divisions in the ruling class kind of create the openings through which genuine revolutionary movements emerge. And I immediately pointed this out. And when I pointed this out inside the Workers' World Party, they said, that's heresy. That's Popular Front revisionism. No, that's Stalinist. Trotsky said that's wrong. That was met with utter revulsion. And then I saw how the Tea Party emerged against Barack Obama and how, Barack Obama was being embraced by the bulk of the American ruling class. But there were certain factions in the ruling class, like the Koch brothers and others, that fought him vehemently. And I said, there's some kind of disagreement in the ruling class. And I even wrote an internal document in the Workers' World Party. And I was accused of anti-Semitism, which was weird because I don't think the document ever mentioned the Jews. But immediately I was accused. They said, well, that idea that there's some division in the ruling class or whatever, that's anti-Semitism. I thought that's weird. But at the time, though, somebody said, you really ought to go read The Yankee and Cowboy War by Carl Oglesby because he made a similar argument. And I didn't really pick it up at that point. And then I came across, the Lyndon LaRouche movement. And I guess he went by Lynn Marcus, right? And you wouldn't know this now, but they were originally a Marxist group. It says that on their Wikipedia page, and that history is there. But Lyndon LaRouche originally went by the name Lynn Marcus. And he was a Trotskyite communist in New York City. And he kind of developed an interesting thesis. He was a shoe salesman. He was in the shoe industry, an advertising consultant. And he was somebody who was was a Trotskyite communist, but he spent a lot of time in these kind of middle-class business circles. And he clearly studied a lot of the literature of the John Birch Society and the old right. And, if you read some of the memoirs, I read a lot of memoirs of people who knew Lyndon LaRouche when he was still calling himself a Marxist. They said Lyndon LaRouche came to the conclusion that the liberals were the main danger and argued that the kind of capitalists who were supporting the John Birch Society, the old right, they were progressive in opposition to the Ford Foundation, in opposition to the Rockefellers and others, because they believed in economic growth, and that the funding for the new left from the Rockefeller think tanks, from the Ford Foundation, from the CIA with their Congress for Cultural Freedom program was being used to promote Malthusian economics, and that the new left was embracing Malthusianism, and that Malthusianism was the most reactionary capitalist ideology, which is what Marx thought. If you read Theories of Surplus Value, Marx makes it clear he thought Malthusianism was the biggest danger. It was the most evil form of economics. And so Lyndon LaRouche started saying the new left, they're being funded by the Malthusian ultra-rich to kind of beat back the John Birch Society and Barry Goldwater. So that's not good. And so he came to that conclusion. And that led Lyndon LaRouche to take positions that put him on the opposite side of the picket line with the leftist groups. For example, there was a teachers' strike in New York City, I think in 1968. And it was the black nationalists had called for community control of schools in Harlem. They wanted black nationalist curriculum and such. And the New York City Teachers Union, the majority of teachers at the time were white, they didn't want that. They didn't agree with that. And so they went on strike against it. And the Weathermen and the Workers' World Party and all the communist groups went and attacked the teachers union with baseball bats and got into fights with the teachers union because they said they were racist. Well, Lyndon LaRouche and his group defended the teachers union. And they argued that the Ford Foundation was funding these black nationalists to privatize education and, break apart the working class in New York City on a racial basis. And so he was on the opposite side. And because Lyndon LaRouche saw Malthusianism as the main threat and not conservatives and not right-wingers, he increasingly was at odds with the new left and increasingly became focused on how the new left was funded by American intelligence and funded by that. And eventually, we know Lyndon LaRouche, he eventually denounced Marxism. He embraced American economics, Friedrich List, and all of that. But Lyndon LaRouche is an interesting case because he was pointing to a certain reality. And that, for example, in the 80s, one of the main things that leftists and communists did is they went around opposing nuclear power. And at the beginning of that, the Communist Party said, whoa, there's nothing inherently wrong with nuclear power. We believe in science. Maybe we don't trust capitalist corporations with public safety, but the idea that splitting an atom is playing God and it's somehow bad, we don't think that. But after a couple of years, the Communist Party gave in and joined the movement against nuclear energy. I was in the Workers' World Party for years, and they've done a lot to cover up the fact that Sam Marcy, their founder, always insisted they never say they were against nuclear power. They said they're against capitalist corporations and they're against the military-industrial complex, and that nuclear power in the United States is tied in with the nuclear. And so they joined the anti-nuclear protest, but they always said technically we're not against nuclear power, right? And that Marxism, you can't be against nuclear power if you believe in science, if you believe in historical progress. You can question the military corporations that you can't really be against nuclear power. You certainly cannot embrace Malthusianism and the concept of overpopulation, because that's something Marx spent much of his life vehemently crusading against. But the new left kind of became a vehicle for the Malthusian ultra-rich, whereas the old right was always just kind of the voice of the lower level capitalists who just wanted to make money and felt that they were being persecuted by the ultra-rich and considered communism to be some kind of conspiracy by Wall Street. If you read the John Birch Society and the stuff that they publish, the old right, they think communism is a conspiracy by Wall Street to restrict their profits. And maybe it didn't start out that way, but if you look at the new left, I mean, if you look at wokeism today, brought to you by, Lockheed Martin, it's very much that. I think Lyndon LaRouche was very much ahead of his time. It wasn't as clear in his day because the left was more friendly to the Soviet Union and was less hawkish back then. Now the left is more hawkish. And I think Lyndon LaRouche was very ahead of his time in understanding that in the long term, the Malthusian ultra-rich would be the main threat. And the lower levels of capital, in my prediction, if you look at China, if you look at Nicaragua, if you look at Vietnam, those governments, those anti-imperialist socialist governments, the way that they have built up their strength is by cultivating a level of lower level capitalists, a level of millionaires and billionaires who are loyal to the project of communism and socialism. So ultimately, the Koch brothers and Elon Musk and the capitalists that are with Trump are going to realize that the only way they can fight the big monopolies that are against them is they're going to need a state that will control the economy and beat back the Malthusian ultra-rich. And it's going to take them forever to learn that because that goes against everything they believe. They don't believe in state control. They believe in libertarianism. They believe if we can just get the government out, everything will be fine. It's going to be a long, hard struggle for them to realize that. But that's what the third world capitalists have realized. Capitalists that are developing in the third world in competition with the first world have realized the only way they have a chance is if they have a popular government to back them up, and that government is mobilizing the working class to have their back. That's what the rich people in America that believe in economic growth and don't like the World Economic Forum and don't like globalism, they're going to have to realize the only chance they ultimately have at getting economic growth and making America a strong economy again, making America great again, they're going to need a popular government that mobilizes the working class to beat back the power of the ultra-rich. And it's going to be very hard for them to learn that, but they're going to have to learn that eventually, and they're going to learn it through the course of struggle.
All right, so before I ask anyone a question, there's another interesting comment in the chat by Waba Cohen. In Praise of Folly was a good book by Erasmus. That's where I got the title for the show. The Dutch communists really liked it and promoted it. People should read it. They should. That's why I wanted to read the quote. But my question for you, Caleb, is could you explain your new book, The Killing of Brian Thompson, and the danger of the years of lead, and also explain what the years of lead are?
All right, so I'll start out with the second question. In Italy, from the 1960s to the 1980s, there was a wave of political violence. And we now know that was a result of Operation Gladio. In Italy, they had the largest communist party in a non-communist country, the Italian Communist Party. And the Italian Communist Party was also the largest political party in all of Europe. It had 1.3 million members. It was a huge political force, and it was anti-NATO. And it was committed to a peaceful road to socialism. In fact, Mao had denounced the Italian Communist Party, and he'd written a pamphlet, the differences between Comrade Togliatti and us, saying that he thought they were revisionists because they advocated a peaceful road to socialism. But the Italian Communist Party had massive public support, and they were determined to get Italy to leave NATO. So the CIA launched this program called Operation Gladio to prevent Italy from leaving NATO. And now we know that that involved funding far-right groups to murder leaders of the Communist Party, and also funding the Red Brigades to engage in bombings and assassinations done in the name of communism that would, cause confusion. And ultimately, the climax of the years of lead was in 1978, the Italian Communist Party got so many votes, the largest amount of votes they'd ever gotten. The Christian Democratic Party, its leader Aldo Moro, met with the Communist Party and announced that they were planning to form a coalition government. At that point, the Red Brigades, the terrorist Red Brigades groups, kidnapped Aldo Moro and killed him to prevent the Italian Communist Party from joining the government. And it was pretty clear, and it was later revealed by Italian journalists, that the Red Brigades did this on behalf of the CIA. It was done in coordination with the CIA. These ultra-radical communist groups, they were being used to create an atmosphere of violence in Italy that would ultimately lead to the population just kind of becoming weary and accepting things and not challenging the status quo. And that's what I argue. The fact that Luigi Mangione is accused, I'm not saying he's necessarily guilty. I don't think he's necessarily guilty. I've seen some convincing arguments he may not have done it. Luigi Mangione is accused of killing Brian Thompson. I'm not here to defend Brian Thompson. I mean, obviously Brian Thompson, made his living denying people health care. I'm not going to defend that. But the problem isn't one guy, it's a system, right? It's not one individual. It's not bad people. It's our private healthcare system in the United States. And immediately, Luigi Mangione is being blasted all across social media as this hero for the common man for shooting somebody on the streets of New York City. And I argue that this is because Trump won the election, because the population is strongly opposed to the way the country is going, that similar to Operation Gladio, the U.S. deep state is trying to foment a wave of political violence that will result in, getting people out of politics. People don't want to get shot. People don't want to get killed. It'll result in making politics very confusing, because that's what happened. Originally, it was the Italian Communist Party versus NATO. And then it became the Italian Communist Party versus the fascists. And then the Italian Communist Party versus the Red Brigades. And the Red Brigades versus the fascists, and the fascists versus NATO. And it got so confusing, right, that people are like, they didn't know what was going on. And the killing was very brutal. At least 428 people lost their lives, but hundreds more were crippled for life. I mean, the Red Brigades, one of their tactics is they would shoot people in their legs to cripple them for life, from the mafia's tradition of kneecapping people. And the Italian fascist groups also killed people. And generally, people didn't want to get involved in politics because if you piss somebody off, you might get shot. And so even though the population was ready to leave NATO and was voting for communism, after a while, there were so many bombings and so many killings, the population had just kind of had it, and they accepted NATO. And that's very similar to what happened in Northern Ireland, the way the provisional IRA was defeated in the 70s and 80s. It's very similar to what happened in Jamaica in the 70s and 80s as well. The way, Michael Manley was this popular socialist leader who admired Fidel Castro, who was going to try to take Jamaica in an anti-imperialist direction. And the CIA fomented all kinds of crazy gang warfare, and people stayed out of politics and got weary. And I argue that the same thing is happening. Right now, the American people just aren't willing to accept the dropping living standards and the wars around the world and the stripping of our civil liberties. And we're just not going to be convinced to accept it. So the strategy is to make politics so confusing, make it so dangerous, and make it so violent that people just kind of say, okay, I don't want to get shot and it doesn't make any sense to me. And they just kind of drop out of it. Luigi Mangione is being celebrated because they're trying to psych up a section of the woke left to support terrorism and killing. That's what I argue is the case. And they want to escalate to violence as a method of, getting the population depoliticized in the long term. That's what I think is going on. And that's the argument that I make in the book. They've already cultivated the woke left to think that, if you don't agree with the transgender thing, or if you disagree with something that they believe in, it's okay to get you fired from your job. It's okay to destroy your reputation and demand that all your friends denounce you. It looks to me like they're taking it to another level. They're psyching up the woke left to say, if you disagree with somebody, it's okay to kill them. Right. And that's very, very frightening. But I think it's probably the only hope that they have. And this happened during the first Trump administration. When Trump was inaugurated, you had Punch a Nazi with Richard Spencer on Inauguration Day. Then you had Charlottesville, which was very clearly allowed to happen. It wasn't a giant conspiracy, but the Klan protesting and anti-Klan people protesting happens all the time. But this time there were no police between them. And the establishment kind of wanted there to be bloodshed at Charlottesville. That's pretty clear. And they got it. And I argue that to make Trump ineffective, to depoliticize the population, they are trying to prematurely escalate politics in America toward violence. And I don't think that that's a good thing. And that ultimately, serious revolutionaries have always advocated a peaceful transition. However, if it's not possible, and if people's rights are under attack, they have a right to defend themselves. But advocating lone wolf acts of assassination is contrary to everything that all serious revolutionaries have always advocated. And when you create a culture of political violence, like was done in Italy, like was done in Northern Ireland, like was done in Jamaica, the result is not a revolution, it's the opposite.
All right. Keith, I'm sure you have some follow-up questions.
Yeah. As far as the class analysis we were discussing earlier, I find that aspect of Caleb's work to be very interesting, because I know I grew up in the 70s among the kind of small town John Bircher populism, right populism that he was describing. Most adults that I grew up around were very big on Goldwater. Some of them belonged to the John Birch Society. Some of them liked George Wallace. Obviously, they liked Reagan. Interestingly, a lot of them were fans of Lyndon LaRouche. I used to know people from that milieu that they used to subscribe to Lyndon LaRouche's newsletter, The Federalist, and all that. So that's the kind of cultural milieu I came up in. When, as a young adult, I started moving more towards the left, and this was like in the late 80s. So I was around a lot of people who were veterans of the new left of the 60s. So at the time, I may be in my early 20s. They're all in their 40s and 50s. But what I have found interesting over the years is the way in which the new left has indeed bended towards the establishment in the way that you described. In the 70s, we used to have these people called the Rockefeller Republicans. And in fact, most conservatives I knew back in the day hated these Rockefeller Republicans, these Northeastern establishmentarians who were basically just a half a step away from communists. But what I've noticed is that a lot of people that I knew that were from the new left milieu, over time, I've seen them become the mirror image of these old school Rockefeller Republicans. For instance, I used to belong to the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. I used to belong to the IWA, which was an anarcho-syndicalist international. I was on the national committee of the American section of that in the late 80s and early 90s. And the fellow who initially recruited me into the IWW is basically now an MSNBC liberal. He's obsessed with J6. He's obsessed with Trump derangement syndrome. He's obsessed with supporting Ukraine in the war in Eastern Europe. He's obsessed with the COVID vaccine, and he's a branch COVIDian, I guess we could call him. And then the fellow who originally nominated me to the IWA's committee, National Committee for their American section, he's even worse. He's now a hardcore Malthusian. He wants to reduce the world population to like 1 billion people. He wants to do away with airplanes. He's also become a law and order person who says we need to crack down on drugs and crime. He sounds like Nelson Rockefeller circa 1973. And right now he's also saying that he's actually come to admire Nixon. You know, he's saying, I used to hate Nixon when I was young. Now I realize he wasn't that bad, you know. So it's interesting how these Rockefeller Republicans and the New Left have sort of merged in many ways. But that gets to my actual question, which I know I've heard you discuss the possibility of a Bonapartism, and you see the liberal wing of the ruling class as being the primary threat as far as an American Bonapartism, a kind of authoritarian effort by capitalists to consolidate their position and by, you know, ironing out, you know, either class conflict or divisions within the ruling class. However, I've also heard Dan Lazare, who was another Marxist writer, make the same argument, although he argues that it's the Trump wing of the ruling class or the Sunbelt wing of the ruling class that is the primary danger of a Bonapartism. And, you know, some of the arguments for that are things like the way in which the Trump has gotten the support of some of the tech oligarchs like Musk, and how some of these people are influenced by guys like Curtis Yarvin and these neo-reactionaries who sort of idealize feudatories like the United Arab Emirates and some of the Gulf states, Kuwait, and all that kind of stuff, these kinds of traditionalist monarchical type of societies. And also how the right is cultivating some of these kind of socially reactionary elements, like certainly the ultra-Zionists, some of these low church evangelicals, these know-nothing nativists, which is very much part of the American tradition, obviously, and also the paranoid, conspiracy, what Richard Hofstadter called the paranoid style conspiracy types, like the Alex Jones types. And Lazare, I think, argues that is the real danger of an American fascism or a Bonapartism, even if not outright fascism. Where would you disagree with Lazare? Because I've always wanted to hear you and Lazare debate this question, because you both make a similar argument, but you identify different sectors of the ruling class as the primary threat.
Well, I guess I want to first off make clear that I don't think Bonapartism is necessarily bad. Bonapartism is it's a phenomenon that when capitalism enters a long-term crisis, factions in the ruling class battle for power, and they use the state to suppress each other and take dramatic action to try and stabilize the economy. Roosevelt was a Bonapartist who enacted all kinds of progressive legislation. Hitler was a Bonapartist who crushed the labor unions and set up a network of concentration camps. Both of them represented one faction of their country's ruling class, and they violently suppressed other sections of the ruling class in order to stabilize society. And that's what Bonapartism is. The original Bonaparte, it comes from Marx. He wrote this pamphlet that's a bit hard to read because, it was in 1851. Marx was living in Paris, and there were all kinds of strikes and protests, and there was mass unemployment. And then Napoleon's nephew, Louis Bonaparte, the military brought him to power and made him the dictator. They declared the Second French Empire. And Louis Bonaparte presented himself as a leftist, right? He was bringing back the ideals of the French Revolution, and it was the Conservative Party, the party of order, that he violently suppressed. And the Conservatives went into exile, and he presented himself as, I think he even called himself a socialist at various times. And he built railroads, and he enacted a 12-hour workday in the factories. And he took a lot of measures that suppressed factory owners and gave kind of some level of rights to workers on the job, while violently suppressing a lot of people who disagreed with him, university professors and other people, and just trying to stabilize French society with heavy-handed moves by the military. And Marx was living there, and there were some socialists who thought this was a great thing. And Marx said, no, this isn't a great thing. This is just an attempt to save capitalism. And this is Louis Bonaparte is a capitalist, a banker, a financier going outside of his own class to mobilize power in order to force his will onto society. And Marx noted that the movement in the streets that Louis Bonaparte created to back him up was called the Society of December 10th. And it was this organization of people that would go out and protest to support Louis Bonaparte. And they were criminals, poor people, bohemian intellectuals, prostitutes, pimps, gangsters. It was a collection of what Marx called the lumpen proletariat. And Marx said we need a mass movement of wage earners, wealth-producing people, like ordinary people who just work to pay their bills, who go on strike. And this is a movement of people that kind of leech off of society, right? That are just kind of desperately poor people who will work for whoever's paying them. That is just kind of the mob that Louis Bonaparte is using to like force his will onto society. And that's Marx writes about. Basically, he's explaining to anyone who will read his pamphlet that what France had in 1851 was not a socialist revolution. It was a military dictatorship responding to a capitalist crisis. And that's what the term Bonapartism refers to. And I would argue that the left, I mean, when you read the passage where Marx is listing all the people that were part of the Society of December 10th, it sounds like Occupy Wall Street. It just sounds like every hippie, every weird artist, every criminal, every primp, every prostitute, they all just kind of gathered in one place into this weird mass of people that are, being kind of directed to serve one end of the ruling class covertly. Someone in the chat says the rent-a-mob of George Soros. That's basically what Louis Bonaparte was doing. But it was effective, right? It created the impression that there was mass public support for him to set the stage for his military coup. That's what Bonapartism is. And you can have Bonapartist governments that do very reactionary things. You can have Bonapartist governments that do very good things. But the essence of it is trying to stabilize capitalism with heavy-handed state repression and suppression of one faction of the capitalist class by another. And I think both sections of the ruling class, the Trump wing and the anti-Trump wing and everything in between, have the potential to do that. And that Bonapartism, divisions in the ruling class, ultimately opens the door to a revolution, right? Like I said, every revolution begins as a fight within the ruling class. So Bonapartism isn't inherently bad. You just have to know it for what it is. As far as the left deteriorating, one factor that, I knew a lot of boomers. I spent so much time around boomer communists, people who joined communist groups in 1968, 1969, and have been doing it ever since. And I have to say that part of the reason so many of them are like your friends you described, they have Trump derangement syndrome, they're backing the FBI, it's trauma, right? Is that these people have gotten the shit kicked out of them by conservatives so much. They've been terrorized by the FBI. COINTELPRO has gone after them. They've seen, leaders of their movement thrown in jail. In 1979, in Greensboro, North Carolina, there was a communist rally, and the Ku Klux Klan showed up and shot 5 people on live television and were acquitted in court. And that these folks kind of live in terror of conservatives, right? That the symbols, that we associate with Trumpism, the flag, the cross, they have this kind of gut level opposition to those things because they associate it with violence and repression leveled against them. And they just kind of have an emotional reaction to all the aesthetics of Trumpism. They just see that as evil. And on top of that, unfortunately, a lot of them, because during the Cold War, U.S. society was much more prosperous and the bulk of the American white working class didn't want to hear what they have to say, they've kind of internalized a belief that we're the others. We're the persecuted. A lot of them are white people who really have a white savior complex. In their minds, all the other white people are bad, but they're the good white people. And they want to be separate from all the other white people because they're the good ones that love the black people. And it's sad. And I sympathize with them. And a lot of them have done very heroic things to stand with the black people against racism and such. But at the same time, that's that kind of mindset that, we're this isolated group of persecuted, righteous, good people. That's not going to lead to changing society. And it's a very defeated mindset. And it's kind of a self-defeating mindset. And that, during the 1970s, the new communist movement, it was the Maoist groups, basically, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the October League, the Communist Labor Party. They said, we're going to take the 60s hippie middle-class movement. We're going to go into the factories. They cut their hair short. They didn't use drugs, and they tried to recruit their coworkers to communism. And they did this for an entire decade, from like 1969 until the early 80s. They were in the factories trying to recruit their coworkers, and it didn't work because living standards in the USA were still pretty high. And at the end of the decade, 78, the U.S. economy crashed, and they thought, now it's going to happen. Now it's going to happen because the U.S. economy has crashed. And they had the Iranian Revolution and the Nicaraguan Revolution. They thought the world's going in a revolutionary direction and the U.S. economy has crashed. Finally, the American workers are going to wake up. And what happened? You had the rise of Reagan. American workers became even more anti-communist, even more conservative. And a lot of them engaged in very adventurous things. The RCP, they did May Day 1980, where they went around burning the American flag and, engaging in very provocative acts to try and, provoke people and stuff. And they ended up getting beaten up. I think one of them was killed at the Alamo in Texas. He pulled down the American flag and put up a communist flag at the Alamo in Texas. And 2 days later, he was stabbed to death. There was another RCP woman who was found dead at the bottom of an elevator shaft in New York City. She'd been out selling the paper, and 2 people just went up to her and killed her. I mean, there's many people that were badly injured and all of that. And based on that trauma, there's just this belief that it cannot be done, that average white Americans are just too conservative and too racist. They'll never be won over to a class struggle program. Well, 1978 was a really long time ago. 1982 was a really long time ago. And the way average Americans think is very different. We're far more racially integrated as a society than we've ever been. And people are far more upset about their economic conditions. This is not 1978. But the communist groups are all kind of led by people who say, well, we tried to go to the masses. We tried to win over average working people, and they don't want to hear it, and they're all racist. And then on top of that, it used to be the mainstream of imperialism was the neocons. But you'll notice the American Enterprise Institute and a lot of the neocon and big oil-funded think tanks have pivoted into the Obama, Kamala Harris circle because the demographics of the United States has changed. The USA is not overwhelmingly white as it once was. The neocon message, which is rooted in Nixon, don't fix it if it ain't broke, my country, right or wrong, that doesn't work with people of color. That doesn't work with immigrants, right? And so wokeification with the same overall goal, which is free market, neoliberalism, free trade around the world, regime change wars, done in the message of wokeification is much more effective now because the demographics of the country have changed. So the neoconservative element has just kind of shifted to wokeism in its messaging style. The goals are still the same. And because of that, a lot of the so-called left, they're so traumatized and they're so damaged. And it's like you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And these people haven't seen any progress their entire lives, right? A big moment for me was the 2008 financial crisis when, according to everything I read, there should have been a surge of interest in communism across America. And there was. I mean, Newsweek said we're all socialists now. And there was certainly polls were showing 10% of Americans said communism was a better system and all of that. But all the communist groups fell on their faces. And I saw it in the RCP and the Communist Party and the Workers' World Party and the Socialist Workers' Party. It was weird. They were handed on a silver platter. There's a financial crisis. The media is saying, oh, maybe there's something to Karl Marx. And Warren Buffett and other people were kind of saying to the left, go do your thing. Just kind of be our street, our counter gang. I think Jesse Jackson even said, we need some street heat to back up Obama. And they were hoping to use the left to kind of build a movement so that Obama could pass more Wall Street reforms and such. And the left tried to do it. And I was there as a 23, 24-year-old, and the left just fell on their faces. They couldn't do it. These groups were so damaged and so incompetent and so lost and so confused. They were handed lots of money from the ruling class and from the labor bureaucracy, and they just completely fell on their faces. And that Occupy Wall Street was kind of take two. The ruling class said, oh, we thought the communists would do it for us. They'd be our useful idiots to bring in Obama wokeism. They can't even do it. So Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and the woke stuff, that's almost like take two after the communist left was just so damaged by decades of defeat. They couldn't even be useful idiots for the ruling class. And it's really a tragedy. But I think a similar story can be said for the right. And in my book, Where is America Going? I've talked about the fact that we're in a weird period where, because there's an economic crisis, we should see a rise of the traditional far right, Nazi groups, white supremacist groups, and a rise of the traditional far left, communist groups, anarchist groups. We're seeing neither. And in fact, on both the so-called left and the so-called right, we have these kind of new inventions. The Proud Boys are not a traditional far-right group, right? Occupy Wall Street and Antifa and groups like that are not traditional far-left groups. And it's almost like the actual ideological political tendencies that would naturally arise under such circumstances don't really have the power to do it. Plus, the intelligence apparatus is kind of not going to allow them to do it. one thing I will comment on, and I'll try to do this without using names, but I've noticed some parallels on both the far left and the far right. There are certain influencers, kind of like BreadTube, that arise. They're not tied to any group, and they immediately become the voice of socialism, the voice of white nationalism or America First or whatever, the voice of whatever you want to call it. And they're not tied to any real organization. And they blow up on social media, and everyone watches them. And then they systemically cancel anybody who's building a real organization, right? And I believe, and that many people have pointed out, like the receipts are there, these people are very much, maybe they don't know that they're being used by the FBI, but people's information gets to the FBI through contacting them. And they're kind of used as, they're almost like scarecrows. They're there to attract extremists and to put out a quote unquote extremist message. And then to make sure no genuine, no serious movement that would be a threat to the status quo emerges. And they kind of function like shock jocks. And this all develops into like fandom. Peter Coffin has written a lot about fandom as a tendency, where it becomes more about personality and drama between streamers and who's beefing with who and sex and all this stuff, not about actual politics and ideology. And BreadTube was kind of a prototype, but now it's a much broader thing. I see it on the right. Look, Angela McCurdle of the Libertarians. I mean, she's like the best leader the Libertarian Party has had. She's organized huge rallies in Washington, D.C. She made the Libertarian Party so important that Donald Trump spoke at their convention. But there are loads of libertarian streamers who do nothing but attack her constantly. And what are they doing? They have social media channels about being libertarians. You see this on the right. You see this on the left. You see this among the woke left, among the anti-woke left that kind of emerged out of nowhere. It's very interesting. They would like everyone to just kind of stay on the internet, arguing with each other and following their favorite personality, not building a real organization and carrying out real operations, which is much more dangerous, right? And that's, I mean, I've been targeted pretty badly because people have access to me. You know, I mean, if all I was doing was streaming on the internet, no one would know anything about my personal life. No one would be able to say this or that. But when you work with people, you know, it's much more dangerous. You're much more exposed, and the state is far more threatened by real operations than they are by just somebody on the internet, you know, giving their opinion, right? But what we need urgently is real operations. You know, Rage Against the War Machine, that rally in 2023 was really important, and you saw the deep state pulled out all the stops against that rally. I've never seen anything like it. They were terrified of that rally. You know, you can say similar things. And the way they take apart organizations, there's almost a method. And I pay attention to this with different political trends, how they target people, how they harass people. And they're really trying to inoculate people from joining any real organization. Because ultimately, if this crisis progresses, people are going to need real organizations. This right now, a lot of these dissident ideas, people are angry, the economy is bad, people are upset with the status quo, but it's still just kind of an intellectual exercise. Conditions will get to the point that it's not an intellectual exercise anymore. In order to eat, you're going to have to be involved in some kind of community, some kind of organization. And when that happens, ideological groups, be they religious, communist, far right, or whatever, are going to be very important. And the ruling elite knows that. And they're very afraid of what could happen as conditions deteriorate.
So a really interesting question now is Trump's foreign policy. So one of the things that I think all of us were a little optimistic about Trump in 2016 because of his his de-escalate with Russia strategy, which seems to still be on the table. So I'm happy with that. The other thing is, I think we can all agree that if Hillary had won in 2016, we'd already be here 8 years ago, but she didn't win. So Trump won, and that just that delayed the result. But I don't think it stopped it. I think ultimately with Biden escalating in Ukraine and then also giving support to Israel over Gaza, there's a hot potato that Trump's going to get. And the question is he going to really be able to, you know, if you have a fiat accompli with the whole world on fire, what are you going to really do? And the other problem is I see that with regards to both Iran and China, Trump is leaning in a more hawkish direction, which is unfortunate. But what are some of your thoughts on the possible future Trump foreign policy?
My position on Trump is that Trump has promised to do a lot of good things. He said he will, you know, bring peace between North and South Korea. He will end the conflict in Ukraine, that he will go after the FBI and expose their political persecution of Americans. If Donald Trump does any of those things, that would be awesome. Obviously, I think it's a long shot, but this is what I've been telling people. If he does any of those things, we have to very loudly show public support for him doing that, or else we can't count on it ever happening. If he does those things, if he moves to end the war in Ukraine and there's not massive public support for him doing it, he's not going to be able to do it. And that I would like to see anything that moves us away from World War III. I'd like to see anything that moves us away from having our civil liberties taken away. I was in Florida supporting the Uhuru movement. They almost went to federal prison for nothing, for free speech, because they said that their free speech as a black socialist group constituted acting as a Russian agent. They had 2 years in federal court. They were found not guilty of being Russian agents. They were convicted of conspiracy, and they got a sentence of probation. They expect their conspiracy conviction to be overturned. But that was a really serious case. And I mean, the FBI raided their homes and pointed guns in their faces. And where were all the socialist and communist groups to support them? They weren't there because they read on the internet, it's a cult, or isn't there somebody in the group who's accused of some sexual and people were willing to just stand back and let the state go and grab this group of black socialists. Tucker Carlson supported them. Glenn Beck supported them. But the communist groups were largely absent because somebody on the internet said blah, 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 blah. And that terrifies me utterly. And I'm really proud of the fact that we raised that case at the United Nations. We had a special press conference that we organized with the United Nations to support the Uhuru movement. I spoke directly to President Putin at the World Youth Festival in March about that case in a video that went viral. And I was in the courtroom with them. I was there when their trial began. I was there at their sentencing hearing. And we were there with them. And that, I mean, this is a very serious situation. So anything that gets us away from, having our freedoms taken away or marching us toward World War III has to be supported. Anything. And if Donald Trump does anything in that direction, we have to loudly support it. I am very disappointed by how many people have given up on Trump already. He hasn't even taken office yet. And there's all these people saying, oh, he's just like all the rest of them. He's hopeless. Well, if you say that, he is. Right? I mean, and I'm not guaranteeing Donald Trump, when he was in office the first time, he murdered Qasem Soleimani and took us to the brink of war with Iran. He moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. He tried to overthrow Venezuela. Trump did awful things in his first term. But a lot of the people who were pushing him to do that, like Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, they betrayed him. And the fact that he wants Tulsi Gabbard to be the intelligence director, the fact that he wants, Kash Patel to run the FBI, maybe something good could happen. And if we just give up on it, it won't happen. And that again, a lot of people in our kind of dissident spaces are very good at losing. They love to just complain about the world and they just assume we've already lost. And yeah, if you give up the fight, you will lose. We need to be there to loudly support anything good Trump might do. And that brings me to, we're having an event for the inauguration at a couple blocks from the White House, themed around peaceful reunification of Korea. And we're going to be there on Inauguration Day with a big banner of Trump and Kim shaking hands, another big banner calling for a peace bridge to connect Alaska to Russia over the Bering Sea. And we're going to do our best to try and push an anti-imperialist message among Trump supporters. And even if Donald Trump doesn't do a single thing, a single one of the good things he promised to do, we still have to build a movement. We still have to build an anti-imperialist movement. So I'm going to be there engaging with Trump supporters. One thing I want to say, right? And I just want to throw this out there because I think it needs to be said. Two and a half years ago, I did something that a lot of people said, Caleb, you are completely crazy for doing this. And you know what I did? I looked up, I knew that the Unification Church, the Moonies, have a history of doing business with North Korea and advocating peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. So I got on the internet and I looked up the local, Unification Church headquarters in New York City. And I walked in on Sunday morning and I introduced myself and I said, I'm a communist and I lead this organization and I support North Korea and I want peace with North Korea. And let's talk, guys. And they didn't know what to make of me. They were terrified of me. But I came the next Sunday, and I came the next Sunday, and I volunteered, and I helped them out, and I continued to be there. And you know what? It's actually turned into a fruitful relationship. We had an event in Los Angeles this spring at Los Angeles Family Church. Center for Political Innovation and LA Family Church had an event dedicated to peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula, where me and a Unification Church pastor spoke on the same platform about North Korea and the hope for peace. And, we marched through the streets of New York City with the Peace MAGA banner of Trump and Kim shaking hands. And I got help in doing that. You know, there were Unification Church members that said, hey, we don't agree with you about a lot of the stuff you say, but you want peace with North Korea and we want peace with North Korea. And they were able to do that. And that shows that if you're committed to doing stuff in real life, not just talking on the internet, you can find friends in very unlikely places. And I will say that. I am committed to getting things done because we urgently need to move away from World War III and move away from the emerging low-wage police state. And, you know, we can argue on the internet all day about who's the true Marxist and who's the real that. I want to build something in real life. And that may be more dangerous and it may, you know, it may result in me having a bad reputation or whatever, but it needs to be done. And I'm willing to work with people I don't agree with to do it. And in fact, I find that the people that are the most effective allies tend to be people I don't agree with. People who are very similar to me politically will find some little nitpicky thing to disagree with me about, and then nothing ever happens. But people I don't agree with me, but share some kind of basic goal, can be very effective allies. So there you go.
All right. Keith, do you have any follow-up questions?
Yeah, Caleb was earlier mentioning the lumpen proletariat and how the base of Napoleon III or Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was often rooted in the lumpen proletariat, and that actually I think is somewhat analogous to some of the situations we face today with Trumpism. There's an English academic named Nima Parvini, known online as Academic Agent. This guy's not on the left. He's on the far right. He's a self-identified Machiavellian in the tradition of Pareto and Mosca and Michaels and thinkers of that type. But he had this recent assessment of MAGA. And what I thought was interesting, he was saying that, let's see if I could just find a couple of the juicier quotes here. He says, after all, MAGA is probably the most genuinely non-racist, pro-black, pro-LGBT, easygoing, and true 90s liberal movement ever to exist. We have won our country back, cry a right wing led by people like Carrie Lake, Caitlyn Jenner, as the black Zoomer in a MAGA hat post a video of himself drinking Coca-Cola to a Libs of TikTok video to 100,000 likes on Twitter. And he says this is really what MAGA is in its core essence. Jerry Springer passed away recently, but his real legacy was MAGA. So Jerry, he says. And in some ways, I think that's fairly accurate. I've seen other analysts compare MAGA to the New Left of the 60s, where it has this kind of transgressive element that's countercultural in a way. It's perhaps a somewhat different type of counterculture, but but then maybe not, because if you look at the actual lifestyles and cultural framework of a lot of MAGA people, you see that they're not really that conventionally bourgeois in a lot of their attitudes. Maybe bourgeois bohemian in some sense, but certainly there's a lumpen presence there. But the question is, I guess, do we really have anywhere in mainstream U.S. politics anything that is really rooted in the working class? It seems to me that a lot of MAGA is more rooted in the petty bourgeoisie, the more small business, small capital, regional capital. And it's clear that the base of the Democratic Party or the so-called left as well is now what Barbara Ehrenreich called the professional managerial class. I mean, if you go to a leftist meeting today, you'll find just as many people who are social workers and public sector bureaucrats and school teachers and university professors as you would anyone that would be considered part of the proletariat in any historic sense. So does the working class have any representation? Because from what I can tell, it doesn't. We clearly have these divisions within the ruling class, the Sun Belt and the Northeast and all that. And then as far as the base of these different factions that they've cultivated, one side cultivates the professional managerial class, the other one cultivates the petty bourgeoisie. And it's not just me that's noticed this. For example, Thomas Piketty, who's a French economist, I guess he's a social democrat or something of that type. But he says that this same pattern is playing out in all of the Western industrialized democracies, where you have what he calls the Brahmin left on one hand, and that is relatively affluent, certainly highly educated people who supposedly are the base of the left. And then you've got the merchant right, which again is this petty bourgeois, small capital class. So it appears that the working class is really nowhere to be found in any of this. So who exactly is going to speak for the working class?
Well, that's interesting. When you talk about the Brahmin left, I mean, you're talking about social workers, you're talking about people who work at NGOs and all of that. And what's very interesting about that is, I was told my whole life, my whole family said to me, you're going to love college, Caleb. When you get to college, you're going to love college. Oh, you're always reading books and talking about politics. You're going to love college. I absolutely hated college. And the role of academic institutions, and maybe you agree or disagree as a professor yourself, Keith, but has really changed. It used to be that, that most of America had a kind of love it or leave it, my country, right or wrong attitude. And colleges were the place where people learned that there's two sides to every story and it's a little more complicated. And it was kind of a bastion of dissident thought. Now it's the opposite. Most of America is alienated. Most of America is upset with their conditions. And college is where you go to get vetted, especially in the humanities and philosophy, to make sure that you don't have any dissident ideas, to make sure you're safe to be hired to be part of. When you talk about the professional managerial class, it's more than that. It's almost like the woke bureaucracy, right? Social workers, people who work at NGOs and all of that. They're almost like there are people at universities who are like the what do they call it? The DEI advisor, whose job it is to just make sure that the university is woke enough and has adequate representation of LGBT. And it's like there's this whole bureaucracy that's been paid for, and it's not all paid for by the government. A lot of it's paid for by foundations and stuff, whose job it is to be like the enforcers of the new liberal ideology. And college is where you go to get vetted to make sure you deserve a spot in that. Right. And it's this whole apparatus that's been created. Its job is to kind of police U.S. society and make sure it's properly woke. And it's kind of terrifying. And people almost argue it's almost like the political commissar that they had in the USSR or something. Every factory had a guy whose job was to make sure that the factory was putting out the communist line or something. And that's kind of what this bureaucracy does. As far as the whole thing about Jerry Springer and all that, Trump's rally at Madison Square Garden, you had Dr. Phil. You had Hollywood Hogan. And, it's interesting because these are all like what they would call B-list celebrities, but they're celebrities that are not part of the club, right? They're all celebrities that are, they appeal to a more working class audience. They're not in major Hollywood movies. And that's why Trump's audience identifies with them, because they feel they're not part of the club either, right? And it's kind of this like, they've been locked out, we've been locked out, and they're mad at those mainstream Hollywood movies. They're mad at those mainstream TV networks, and they're kind of saying we're on the outside, and we don't like the way things are. The other thing is that when I first got politically active during the Iraq War days, I grew up in a small town like you did. I never heard anyone talking about the Illuminati. I never heard anyone talking about the Freemasons. The white people I grew up around, they never talked about that. When I came to Cleveland, though, and I was in, East Cleveland and in Collinwood and other places, we'd be out selling communist newspapers and someone would say, oh, it's the Freemasons that secretly control everything. It's the Jews that secretly control everything. It's the Scottish Rite and the Federal Reserve bankers. And that kind of, what you might call like conspiratism was very much a black thing. And it was not, most white people didn't go there, right? And it wasn't really until the financial crisis that the first time I ever heard of Alex Jones was just before Bush left office. I remember I was at anti-war rallies and a bunch of young Middle Eastern guys in Cleveland showed up with big stacks of DVDs of Alex Jones, 9/11 truth films. They were just giving away because they wanted people to see them. And they were Middle Eastern guys that were pro-Palestine that were like, oh, you got to watch Alex Jones. It's so good. And, now Alex Jones is pretty mainstream. And that you could argue that a lot of the working class resentment that people have against the system, the so-called white middle class didn't used to have, and now it has. And that's kind of, I don't think that's lumpen. I think that's just normal, right? But 60s rhetoric considered the black working class to be lumpen. They're not lumpen in the sense that Marx wrote about. The lumpen proletariat, as Marx referred to it, is they're not wealth producing. They're not wage workers. They're criminal elements or, nefarious elements that are mooching off of other workers, right? They're tricking other workers out of their money. They're robbing people. They're strike breakers. They're homeless people who beg for a living. They're kind of living off of the working class in kind of a parasitical way. They have a parasitical relationship with the working class. Whereas the overwhelming majority of Black Americans are just working class people. They sell their labor power to a corporation. They get a paycheck. The Black Panthers and Frantz Fanon had this whole thing about, well, they're the lumpen proletariat because they tend to be poorer and all that. But no, they're just working class people who tend to be poorer. And that there's kind of a romanticization, like all Black people are lumpen and they have nothing to lose but their chains. And they're going to lead the revolution and all that. And that's very much a 1960s deviation. But the sentiments that have existed among the Black working class for a long time, that the government, is trying to wipe us out. It's run by a secret conspiracy. They want to prevent us from having children. They want to drive down the population. Those kind of sentiments are much more widespread among white workers now than they were before. And that's because that labor aristocracy, the layer of working class people who were living a comfortable lifestyle, has gone away, right? And living standards have gone down among white workers. And so they're more skeptical than they were before. What is interesting is that during the Cold War, if one went to prison, especially Black people went to prison, among prisoners, the main thing prisoners were reading was Marxist literature, right? When someone went to prison, they read George Jackson, they read Mao, they read all of that. And in the military also, if someone was in the military and they didn't like the Vietnam War, they would start passing around Mao's little red book or communist literature trying to figure it out. Now, if one goes to prison, one will find Behold a Pale Horse. One will find Atlas Shrugged. One will find more conspiratorial and libertarian stuff. And it's the same in the military. A lot of people in the military don't like the wars, but they're not reading Marxist literature. They're reading, libertarian and conspiracy kind of literature as well. So it's interesting to see how this is kind of played out, is that kind of, conspiracy stuff that is more libertarian in its approach. Maybe it has a Larouchian influence to some degree. Maybe some of it, draws from the Marxist critique of capitalism and imperialism and expositions about the CIA, but it's really not advocating, the workers control the means of production. That stuff has kind of filled the void as the main kind of anti-establishment rhetoric. And I think that's largely because Marxist groups no longer market themselves to say things that those kind of folks would want to hear. You go to any Marxist group, you're going to hear about marginalized communities and people of color and transgender, and you're going to hear about how worker cooperatives are just so much better because the workers get a share of the profits, and you're not going to hear anything like populistic. You're not going to hear the struggle of the masses to defeat the elite. You're not going to hear any popular. Marxism has completely become divorced from populism. It's become part of that woke, apparatus. It's, and so because of that, it doesn't appeal to people that feel marginalized and are at odds with the system, like people in the military and like people in the prisons once did.
So I feel like we're at that point in the conversation where anything new would be another 2 hours.
Right.
And I'm like, we also want to leave room for Caleb to come back on to have future conversations. So I think it'd be a good place to put a bookmark in. So what do you want to leave us with before we wrap all this up?
Well, the Center for Political Innovation, we need to build a real anti-imperialist movement in America. We need to organize and demand a government of action to fight for working families. We need to stop the march toward World War III and the danger of a new world war and a low-wage police state. We're organizing, and we have a real community of people. We put on workshops. We're doing the inauguration thing at the end of this month, January 20th. Then we're headed to Minnesota. So if you're in the Minnesota area and you want to come and spend a day with us at a workshop we're doing in Minnesota, by all means, reach out to us. We actually have a special deal right now where we're allowing people to join for free for their first month. They don't have to pay dues if you go and sign up on the website for the first month. And if they like it, and then they can keep paying dues. If not, they can cancel their membership and move along. But we're offering people a community. I've said many times that there are two ways to find happiness in this life. The first way is to love and connect with other people. And the second way is to build and construct and change the world and build something. And CPI exists to do both of those things while espousing an anti-imperialist, anti-globalist, pro-working families message. So, we're trying to build a community of people that are dedicated to carrying out operations to educate and spread anti-imperialism in America. If you want to get involved, you want to give us a try, check us out. We've got chapters all over the country. We're an organization. We're dedicated to trying to build a new America. And that I also want to say that everything we do should be motivated with good intentions. We want to build, we want to construct, we want to make a better country and a better world. It's not about revenge. It's not about resentment. It's not about jealousy and tearing things down. You have to be putting a good message out there if you want good things to come. So everything we do is motivated with good intentions, and that we want to build a better world. And that any political movement, if your intention is to just kind of express your resentment, express your rage, express your disappointment and frustration, it's not going to go anyplace good. And that good and evil can wear all kinds of different political clothes. It's more about what kind of vibe and what kind of community you're building, rather than what ideology you necessarily espouse.
Well, I want to say, everybody, if you want to see high-powered commentary, just tune into Keith and I and Caleb, and we're all going to come here and just give you some high-powered commentary. Thanks for being here, Caleb. It was a pleasure having you on.
Sure thing. Always a pleasure. And this was great. Great conversation.
All right. Thank you, Keith. Always insightful commentary. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.